I thought I knew what betrayal felt like. I'd been married for 37 years before my husband Richard passed, and in that time, we'd weathered our share of storms. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I saw on that doorbell camera footage on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Nothing prepared me for the moment I realized my own son had been lying to me for months, and that the woman I'd welcomed into our family with open arms was the architect of my worst nightmare. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to have that trust shattered into a million pieces, you know exactly where this story is going. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world right now, drop a comment and let me know where you are, because this kind of pain, this kind of betrayal, it doesn't have borders. It happens everywhere. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about real people facing real heartbreak and finding real justice, check the description box below. You're going to want to stick around for what comes next. My name is Eleanor, though everyone's called me Ellie since I was a girl growing up in Pittsburgh. I'm 63 now, with silver hair I finally stopped dyeing 2 years ago and hands that show every year I've lived. I raised 2 boys in a modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs of Cleveland, working double shifts as a nurse while Richard managed a hardware store downtown. We weren't rich, but we were happy. We were a family. My oldest son, David, was always the golden child. Straight A's, baseball scholarships, a degree in engineering from Ohio State. He married a woman named Jessica when he was 29, and I remember standing in that church thinking my prayers had been answered. She was beautiful, articulate, ambitious. She worked in marketing for a pharmaceutical company. She smiled at all the right moments during family dinners. She called me Mom, within 3 months of dating David. I should have seen it then. That eagerness. That performance. But when you're a mother who's spent her whole life wanting the best for her children, you see what you want to see. You believe the fairy tale because you've worked so hard to earn it. Richard died 4 years ago. Sudden heart attack while trimming the hedges on a Sunday morning. One moment he was humming along to the radio, the next he was gone. David and Jessica were there for me through all of it. The funeral arrangements, the paperwork, the endless nights when grief felt like drowning. They insisted I sell the house, said it was too big for one person, too full of memories. They helped me find a smaller place just 15 minutes from their home in Lakewood. A cute little bungalow with a front porch and a doorbell camera that came with the security system. That camera. God, that camera. For the first year after I moved in, everything seemed perfect. David and Jessica visited every Sunday for dinner. We'd sit on my porch in the summer, drinking lemonade and talking about their plans to start a family. Jessica would rest her hand on mine and tell me how lucky she was to have me as a mother-in-law. How some women got monsters, but she got me. I'd laugh and squeeze her hand back, feeling grateful, feeling blessed. But then things started to shift. Subtly at first. Sunday dinners became every other week. Then once a month. Phone calls got shorter. When I'd ask David if everything was okay, he'd sigh in that way that made me feel like I was being needy, being too much. Jessica was busy with work, he'd say. They were stressed. They needed space to figure out their lives. I understood. Or at least, I tried to. I didn't want to be that mother-in-law, the one who suffocated her children with need. So I backed off. I stopped calling as much. I waited for them to reach out. And when weeks would pass without hearing from them, I'd tell myself it was normal. This was what happened when children grew up and built their own lives. Then came the money. 6 months ago, David called me on a Wednesday night. I remember because I was watching Jeopardy and I almost didn't answer, thinking it was a telemarketer. But it was my son, and his voice sounded strained, almost desperate. He needed help, he said. A loan. $15,000. There'd been an unexpected medical expense. Jessica had some tests done, some procedures. Insurance didn't cover everything. They were drowning. Could I help them? I didn't hesitate. I'd been careful with Richard's life insurance money, had a decent amount saved from my nursing pension. $15,000 would hurt, but if my son needed it, if Jessica was sick, how could I say no? I transferred the money the next day. David called to thank me, promised they'd pay me back within 6 months. Jessica sent a text with a heart emoji. I felt useful again. Needed. 2 months later, They asked for more. Another 10,000. Different excuse this time. David's car had died, needed a new transmission, couldn't afford the payments. Again, I sent the money. Again, the grateful phone call, the promises to repay. But here's what ate at me, what kept me up at night staring at the ceiling. I'd see their social media posts. Jessica at expensive restaurants, holding wine glasses that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. David posting photos from a weekend trip to Nashville. New furniture in their living room. A designer handbag on Jessica's arm. And I'd tell myself I was being paranoid, being jealous, being an old woman who didn't understand how young people lived. Maybe they'd gotten bonuses at work. Maybe those things were gifts. Maybe I was imagining problems where none existed. The doorbell camera had been broken for 3 weeks. The lens had cracked during a bad storm, and the feed just showed static. I'd mentioned it to David during one of our increasingly rare phone calls, said I was planning to get it fixed. He'd barely responded, just a distracted "that's good mom," before changing the subject to tell me they couldn't make it for Thanksgiving this year. Too much going on. Maybe Christmas. I didn't tell him when I actually scheduled the repair. I don't know why. Maybe some part of me, some instinct buried deep, knew something was wrong. Maybe I was just tired of reporting every detail of my life to a son who seemed increasingly uninterested. The repairman came on a Monday morning, replaced the camera, showed me how the new app worked on my phone. It had a feature where it saved the last 72 hours of footage automatically, stored it in the cloud. On Tuesday afternoon, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking tea when I remembered I hadn't checked if the new camera was working properly. I pulled out my phone, opened the app, and that's when I decided to scroll back through the previous day's footage. Just to test it. Just to see. And that's when my entire world collapsed. The timestamp said 2:47 p.m., Monday afternoon. Just a few hours after the repairman had left. I watched my son's car pull into my driveway, nothing unusual about that. David had a key to my house. He'd drop by sometimes when I was at my book club or running errands. He'd said it made him feel connected to his dad, being in the house where some of Richard's furniture now lived. But this time, I was watching. This time, I saw. Avid got out of the driver's side. And Jessica emerged from the passenger seat wearing clothes I'd never seen before. A tight dress that seemed more appropriate for a nightclub than a Monday afternoon. They were laughing. Actually laughing. And then David opened the back door of the car and pulled out boxes. Moving boxes. The kind you get from U-Haul. I watched, my tea growing cold in my trembling hand, as my son and daughter-in-law made 6 trips from the car into my house. Carrying boxes, bags, what looked like a small filing cabinet. They were inside for 43 minutes. I know because I stared at that timestamp, watching it tick forward, each minute feeling like an hour. When they finally came out, the boxes were gone. The car was empty. And David locked my front door behind him like he'd just finished the most normal errand in the world. I sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe they were storing things for me. Maybe they'd bought me furniture as a surprise. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation that would make me feel foolish for even questioning it. But I knew better. Somewhere deep in my gut, I knew. I waited until the next morning. Wednesday. I drove to my house at 10 a.m. when I knew David would be at work. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, my own door, to my own house that I'd bought with my own money. I stepped inside and everything looked normal. The living room was exactly as I'd left it. Kitchen clean. Bathroom untouched. Then I went into my bedroom. Into the walk-in closet Richard had built for me 30 years ago. The back corner, behind my winter coats, where I kept old suitcases and storage bins, that's where I found them. 7 boxes, neatly stacked. I pulled the first one down, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I opened it. Files. Dozens and dozens of files. Financial documents. Bank statements with David's name and Jessica's name. Credit card bills. Loan applications. Mortgage papers. For properties I'd never heard of. For accounts I didn't know existed. For debts that made my knees buckle. I spent 4 hours in that closet, going through every single piece of paper. And with each document I read, The truth assembled itself like a horrible puzzle I couldn't unsee. David and Jessica weren't struggling. They weren't drowning in medical bills or unexpected expenses. They were running a rental property business, 5 properties across 3 states. They'd bought their first one 2 years ago, right around the time Richard died. They'd used my grief, my vulnerability, my desperate need to feel useful to my family. The $25,000 I'd given them hadn't gone to medical bills or car repairs. It had gone toward down payments on investment properties. Properties they were now renting out for profit. Properties that were generating income. While I sat in my modest bungalow, eating canned soup and clipping coupons, they were building a real estate empire on my dead husband's life insurance money. But that wasn't the worst part. Oh no. The worst part was buried in a folder marked estate planning. I almost didn't open it. Almost convinced myself I'd seen enough, that I should just confront them, demand my money back, cut them off. But something made me look. And I'm so glad I did, even though what I found nearly destroyed me. Inside that folder were documents that showed David had been named as my power of attorney 3 years ago, something I'd signed shortly after Richard died when I was so deep in grief I barely remembered my own name. There were also drafts of legal documents, notes in Jessica's handwriting, plans for how they'd handle Mom's assets when the time comes. Plans for how they'd sell my house, liquidate my accounts. There was even a letter to a lawyer, asking about the timeline for having someone declared incompetent due to age-related mental decline. They were planning to take everything. Not just my money. Everything. My home. My independence. My dignity. And they were going to do it by declaring me mentally unfit. I sat on my closet floor, surrounded by evidence of my son's betrayal, and I couldn't breathe. This was the child I'd rocked through nightmares, the boy I'd worked double shifts to put through college, the man I'd loved more than my own life. And he was planning to steal my future. To have me declared incompetent. To put me in a home somewhere while he and his wife lived off the money Richard and I had spent 40 years building. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you loved more than yourself, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next is how I got every single piece of my power back. And if you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you have no idea. Check the description for more stories about real people taking back what's theirs. I didn't confront them that day. I carefully put every document back exactly as I'd found it. I res-tacked the boxes. I locked my house and drove home, and I did something I hadn't done since Richard's funeral. I planned. Carefully. Quietly. With the kind of precision that only comes from pure, crystallized rage mixed with a mother's broken heart. They thought I was old. Forgetful. Easy to manipulate. They were about to learn that 63 years on this earth had taught me things about revenge they couldn't begin to imagine. The first thing I did was nothing. For 2 weeks, I carried on exactly as before. I answered David's occasional phone calls with the same cheerful voice. When Jessica texted me a photo of their cat with a heart emoji, I sent one back. I played the role they'd cast me in. The aging mother, grateful for scraps of attention, too naive to see the truth happening right under her nose. But at night, I worked. I photographed every single document in those boxes with my phone, uploaded them to a cloud storage account David didn't know I had. I made spreadsheets tracking every property they owned, every loan they'd taken out, every lie they'd told me. I became an accountant, a detective, a woman building a case with the patience of someone who'd spent 40 years in nursing, where details meant the difference between life and death. I also did something else. Something that would make all of this possible. I went to see a lawyer. His name was Robert Patterson, and he came highly recommended from a woman in my book club whose daughter had gone through a nasty divorce. His office was in downtown Cleveland, one of those old buildings with mahogany panels and leather chairs that smelled like justice and old money. I dressed carefully that day, my best slacks, a blazer, my hair neat. I wanted him to see a competent woman, not a victim. I laid out everything. The money I'd given them, the lies they'd told, the documents hidden in my house, the power of attorney I'd signed without understanding, the plans to have me declared incompetent. I watched Robert's face change as I spoke, moving from professional interest to barely contained anger. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said something I'll never forget. "Mrs. Morrison, your son and daughter-in-law aren't just betraying you. They're committing fraud. Elder financial abuse. Potentially even conspiracy. We can destroy them. But here's the thing about revenge. When it's done right, it's not about destruction. It's about justice. It's about making someone face exactly what they've done, in a way they can't deny or explain away. I didn't want to destroy David. God help me, I still loved him. But I needed him to understand the magnitude of his betrayal. I needed him to know that underestimating me was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Robert and I crafted a plan over the next 3 weeks. First, we'd revoke the power of attorney. Immediately, legally, with documentation that made it impossible for David to challenge. Then we'd file a civil lawsuit for the return of my money, with interest. But here's where it got interesting. Robert discovered that because David and Jessica had used my money for business purposes without my knowledge or a formal loan agreement, and because they'd misrepresented their financial situation to obtain those funds, we could potentially go after not just the money I'd given them, but a portion of the profits from those rental properties. My $25,000 had helped generate significant rental income over the past 2 years. That income was legally tied to my unwitting investment. Robert's eyes gleamed when he explained this part. We weren't just asking for my money back. We were asking for my share of their real estate empire. But I wanted more than money. I wanted the truth to come out in a way that made David and Jessica face what they'd done, not just to me, but to the idea of family itself. So I planned a Thanksgiving dinner. I called David 3 weeks before the holiday. Used my sweetest voice, my most vulnerable tone. Told him I knew they'd said they couldn't come, but I was feeling so lonely, missing his father so much. Could they please reconsider? Just this once? It would mean the world to me. There was a long pause. I could almost hear Jessica in the background, probably rolling her eyes, probably annoyed at the inconvenience. But David agreed. They'd come. 4 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day. Those 3 weeks were the longest of my life. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., my heart racing, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Wondering if I should just take my money and walk away, cut them off quietly, avoid the confrontation. But then I'd remember those documents in my closet. Those plans to declare me incompetent. The casual cruelty of using my grief as a tool for their profit. And I'd remember something Richard used to say, people don't change because you're nice to them. They change when facing themselves becomes unavoidable. I prepared for that Thanksgiving like I was preparing for battle. I cooked all of David's favorite foods, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes with extra butter, green bean casserole, the apple pie recipe his grandmother had passed down. I set the table with the good china, the pieces that had belonged to my mother. I put on the dress I'd worn to David's wedding. I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted them to remember this meal for the rest of their lives. Robert would be there too, though David and Jessica didn't know it yet. He'd arrive at 4:30, giving them just enough time to settle in, to let their guard down, to start eating my food and accepting my hospitality before the hammer fell. The morning of Thanksgiving, I stood in my kitchen watching the sunrise, and for the first time in months, I felt powerful. Not angry. Anger is hot and chaotic. This was something colder. Clearer. This was the feeling of someone who'd been knocked down, counted out, and was about to prove that being underestimated was the greatest weapon of all. At 3:55 p.m., I heard a car pull into my driveway. I checked my doorbell camera. Yes, the one that had shown me the truth. There they were. David and Jessica, walking up to my front door, their faces set in expressions of dutiful obligation. They looked like people going to a chore, not a family dinner. Jessica was checking her phone. David's shoulders were slumped. I opened the door before they could knock, my smile bright and genuine. Because in that moment, I knew something they didn't. I knew this was the last Thanksgiving dinner we'd ever share. And I knew that by the time the sun set, their entire world would be different. Come in, I said, hugging them both. I'm so glad you're here. I have so much to be thankful for this year. Jessica hugged me back, and I could feel the impatience in her body, the desire to get this over with. David kissed my cheek and I could smell his cologne, the same one Richard used to wear. It nearly broke me right there. But I held steady. I'd come too far to fall apart now. The first 30 minutes were almost normal. We sat in the living room making small talk while the food stayed warm in the kitchen. Jessica told me about a promotion she was up for at work. A lie, I now knew, since I'd called her company pretending to be an old friend and learned she'd actually been demoted 6 months ago for performance issues. David talked about a project at his engineering firm, and I nodded along, playing my part perfectly. At 4:30, the doorbell rang. "Oh," I said, standing up with a smile. "I forgot to mention, I invited someone else. I hope you don't mind." I saw confusion flicker across David's face, then mild annoyance. Jessica's lips tightened. They exchanged a look that said, "Great, who is this? Some lonely neighbor she's forcing us to entertain?" I opened the door and Robert Patterson walked in, carrying a leather briefcase that David and Jessica didn't yet understand was full of documents that would change everything. "David, Jessica," I said, my voice steady. "This is Robert Patterson. He's my attorney." The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. David's face went pale, then flushed red. Jessica's hand flew to her mouth. They looked at each other, and in that look, I saw the exact moment they realized I knew. "Mom," David started, standing up. "What is this? What's going on?" I gestured for everyone to sit down. My hands weren't shaking anymore. My voice was calm. "Robert, why don't you explain?" For the next 20 minutes, Robert laid it out. The documented financial fraud. The $25,000 obtained under false pretenses. The hidden rental properties. The plans to have me declared incompetent. The power of attorney I'd revoked 2 weeks ago. The civil lawsuit we'd already filed. The potential criminal charges for elder financial abuse. With each revelation, I watched my son's face crumble. Jessica tried to interrupt several times, tried to explain, to justify, to minimize. But Robert just kept talking, kept pulling documents from his briefcase, kept building the case that would destroy their carefully constructed lies. "These rental properties," Robert said, spreading out bank statements on my coffee table, generated approximately $78,000 in net income over the past 2 years. Mrs. Morrison's $25,000 loan represented approximately 40% of your initial investment capital, which means she's entitled to 40% of those profits. That's $31,200, plus the return of her original $25,000, plus interest at the legal rate of 8% annually. In total, you owe Mrs. Morrison approximately $62,000. Jessica's face had gone from red to white. "We don't have that kind of money. We'd have to sell properties. We'd have to." "Yes," I said quietly. "You would. Just like I had to survive on canned soup while you built your empire. Just like I had to watch my savings dwindle while you posted photos from expensive restaurants." David finally spoke, his voice broken. "Mom, please. We can explain. It's not what it looks like." And that's when something inside me snapped. Not with rage, but with clarity. "Then explain it, David. Explain to me how using your dead father's life insurance money to fund your business while lying about medical emergencies is anything other than what it looks like. Explain to me how planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can steal my house is anything other than exactly what it is. Explain to me how the son I raised, the boy I worked myself to exhaustion for, became someone who could look me in the eye and treat me like an ATM machine with an expiration date." Tears were streaming down David's face now. "I'm so sorry. Mom, I'm so sorry. It started small, and then it just..." "Jessica said we needed to invest to build something, and you had money just sitting there, and we thought..." "You thought I was old and stupid," I finished. "You thought I'd never find out. You thought I was just some elderly woman you could manipulate and eventually discard when I was no longer useful." Jessica stood up abruptly. "I don't have to listen to this. David, we're leaving." "Sit down," Robert said sharply. "If you leave now, I'll have the police here within the hour. Elder financial abuse is a criminal offense in Ohio. You can deal with this civilly, or you can deal with it in criminal court. Your choice." She sat. For the next hour, we negotiated. Not because I wanted their money, though I deserved every penny, but because I needed them to understand consequences. Robert laid out the terms: full repayment of $62,000 within 90 days, to be secured by a lien on their properties. A formal apology, in writing, acknowledging their fraud. Agreement to enter family counseling, though I suspected we'd never actually attend. And most importantly, a legal agreement that they would never again attempt to gain power of attorney, challenge my mental competency, or interfere with my financial affairs. If they refused, we'd pursue criminal charges. Robert had already been in contact with the district attorney's office. Elder abuse cases were prosecuted aggressively in Ohio. They could face significant prison time. They signed everything. Jessica's hand shook so badly she could barely hold the pen. David cried through the entire process. When it was over, they stood to leave, and David looked at me with eyes so full of pain and shame that for a moment, I almost broke. "Mom," he whispered, "can you ever forgive me?" I thought about it. Really thought about it. Could I forgive the son who'd betrayed me so completely? Could I forgive the woman who'd helped orchestrate my potential downfall? Could I forgive them for seeing me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited and eventually discarded? "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe someday. But right now, you need to leave." They left. The Thanksgiving meal I'd cooked so carefully sat untouched on the table. Robert stayed for another hour, making sure I was okay, making sure the signed documents were properly secured. When he finally left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the ruins of what had been my family. I thought I'd feel triumphant, victorious. But instead, I felt hollow, empty. Like I'd won the battle but lost something much more precious in the process. That was 8 months ago. David and Jessica paid back every penny, though it took them the full 90 days and required them to sell 2 of their properties at a loss. I used some of the money to take a trip to Italy, something Richard and I had always planned but never got around to. I used the rest to set up a trust for my younger son, the one who'd never asked me for anything, who'd just quietly lived his life with integrity. I haven't spoken to David since that Thanksgiving. He's called a few times, sent letters. Jessica sent a long email apologizing, explaining that she'd grown up poor and was terrified of being poor again, that she'd pushed David into things he wouldn't have done on his own. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's just another manipulation. I don't know anymore. What I do know is this: betrayal changes you. It teaches you that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. That the people you die for might see you as nothing more than a transaction. That love, real love, has to be earned and maintained, not assumed because of shared DNA. But it also teaches you something else. It teaches you that you're stronger than you think. That being underestimated can be a weapon. That justice doesn't always come with a sword and a shout. Sometimes it comes with patience, planning, and the quiet determination of someone who refuses to be a victim. I'm 64 now. I live in my little bungalow with my doorbell camera that works perfectly. I have coffee with friends, volunteer at the hospital where I used to work, and on good days, I think about maybe, possibly, eventually forgiving my son. Not for him. For me. Because carrying hatred is exhausting, and I've spent too many years being exhausted. But I'll never forget. And I'll never again mistake someone's need for my resources as love. That lesson cost me $25,000 and a son. But it bought me back my power, my dignity, and the knowledge that I can survive anything. Even the betrayal of someone I loved more than life itself. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been betrayed or taken advantage of, head down to the description box. There are more stories there, stories about real people facing real injustice and finding real strength. Stories that remind us we're not alone in our pain, and that sometimes, the best revenge is simply refusing to be broken. And to David, if you ever watch this, and I think you might, I want you to know something. I still love you. Somewhere underneath all this hurt and anger and disappointment, that love is still there. But love without respect is worthless. Love without honesty is poison. And until you understand that, until you really face what you did and why, we'll remain strangers who once knew each other. I hope someday you'll understand. I hope someday you'll become the man I raised you to be, the man your father believed you were. But if you don't, if you never do, I'll survive that too. Because that's what I've learned, in 64 years of living, loving, losing, and fighting back. Survival isn't about avoiding pain. It's about walking through it, learning from it, and coming out the other side with your dignity intact and your power reclaimed. And nobody, not even my own son, can ever take that away from me again.